The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism is William Rowe's best-known essay. Rowe came from a religious family and had planned on becoming a minister. Over multiple years, however, Rowe gradually became an atheist. One of the essay's most noteworthy elements, though, is its respect for theist belief. There are three parts to Rowe's essay. In the first, he presents an argument for atheism based on the problem of evil. In the second part, Rowe presents what he thinks is the strongest theist response to the problem of evil. And in the final part, he considers what perspective an atheist should hold with regard to theist belief. As a careful reasoner, Rowe begins his argument by clarifying its basic terms. Theism, atheism, and agnosticism can mean very different things to different people. Rowe distinguishes between narrow and broad senses of each term. A narrow theist believes in an all-powerful, all-knowing, supremely good, and eternal being. A broad theist, by contrast, only believes in the existence of some kind of divine being without committing to specific attributes. Now consider atheism. A narrow atheist rejects the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and supremely good God. A broad atheist makes a much stronger claim, rejecting the existence of any kind of divine being. For the purposes of his argument, Rowe is using theism and atheism in their narrow senses. This means that an atheist, as Rowe is using the term, could believe in the existence of a divine being so long as she or he denies that the divine being is all-knowing, all-powerful, and supremely good. There is one final term to clarify: evil. What does it mean to count something as evil? Rowe defines evil as any intense suffering, whether experienced by a human or other animal. Some evils might be deserved or serve some greater purpose. Consider the dog on the right. If the dog had been chasing and harassing a porcupine, then it's possible to argue that the suffering experienced by the dog is justified. But even when suffering is justified, it is nonetheless an evil. Rowe is now prepared to present a three-step argument for why the problem of evil rationally justifies atheism. The first premise states that there are cases of suffering that an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God could prevent without sacrificing some greater purpose. In other words, the first premise asserts there are some evils in the world that are not redeemed. Premise 2 states that an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God would prevent all evils unless the evils were necessary for some greater purpose. In other words, the second premise asserts a supremely good divine being would not allow unnecessary suffering. Claiming the truth of the two premises, the atheist concludes that there is no all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God. Rowe agrees with this three-step argument, whose basic outline dates back thousands of years. Rowe's distinctive contribution to the problem of evil is clarifying the contrasting perspectives of atheism and theism. For the rest of the essay's first part, Rowe examines the credibility of the two premises. He begins by examining premise 2, since it is a claim that atheists and theists can both agree on. This sets up the analysis of premise 1, which is the decisive point of disagreement between theists and atheists. Remember that the second premise states that a supremely good, powerful, and all-knowing God would prevent any unnecessary suffering. This part of Rowe's argument clarifies a shared belief for most atheists and theists. To disagree with premise 2 would require a reinterpretation of at least one of the attributes commonly assigned to God, maybe a reinterpretation of what it means for God to be all-loving or all-powerful. Since narrow theists and atheists agree on this claim, the focus of Rowe's discussion is on premise 1. The first premise of the atheist argument states that there is unnecessary suffering in the world that an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God could have prevented. Rowe presents the example of a baby deer who is gravely injured by a forest fire. The baby deer suffers for multiple days before dying from its burns. What greater purpose could the fawn's suffering have served? Even if the death of the fawn was necessary to control an overpopulation of deer, an all-powerful God could have intervened to have the baby deer die immediately. Rowe believes that premise 1 is true, but admits that it is impossible for a human to definitively prove the premise's truth. It would require being omniscient. In other words, to prove premise 1 true, you would need to know the causal interconnections between everything in the universe. But even if it's impossible to prove premise 1 true, the endless number of examples, similar to the fawn, provide very strong rational grounds to believe in its truth. Notice that proving premise 1 false is just as hard for the theist. Proving premise 1 false would also require knowing the causal interconnections between everything in the universe in order to show how the suffering of a particular animal, like a baby deer, serves a greater good. To conclude the atheist argument, Rowe further explains the difference between rational grounds and proof. To have rational grounds for a belief is not a guarantee of truth. In Rowe's examples, he mentions two individuals who badly lost presidential elections, Barry Goldwater and George McGovern. These two individuals lost by the widest margins of any other candidates in the U.S. presidential election. Hence, it was extremely unlikely that either individual would ever run for president again, let alone win the election. Since Rowe wrote the essay, both Goldwater and McGovern have now died without ever winning the presidency, so we know with certainty that neither will ever be president of the U.S. An updated version of these examples would be to claim that neither Arnold Schwarzenegger nor Michael Dukakis will ever be president. Dukakis himself lost a presidential election, while Schwarzenegger was born in Austria. For Schwarzenegger to become president, it would require changing the U.S. Constitution, which currently prohibits people born outside of the country from becoming president. Hence, even though Schwarzenegger might be popular with many people, it is extremely unlikely that he would become president. Relating this back to Rowe's atheist argument, having rational grounds for a belief is sufficient reason for holding the belief. Thus, Rowe believes that the problem of evil rationally justifies atheism. What is the best theist response to the problem of evil? Despite his own atheist viewpoint, Rowe does think there is a rational defense of theism. As discussed in the first part of the essay, the key disagreement is over premise 1. A direct attack of premise 1 consists of identifying goods that require intense suffering. This amounts to directly taking on examples like the baby deer suffering multiple days from wildfire burns and providing an explanation of what greater good was achieved or what greater evil was prevented. Rowe notes two issues with this kind of direct attack. First, as discussed in the first part of the essay, humans do not know enough about the causal web of the universe to definitively answer such questions. Human knowledge is simply too limited. Second, most religions oppose this kind of calculation of suffering and good. Rather than responding to a tragedy by explaining what greater good is served, it's more likely to hear something like, God works in mysterious ways. In other words, most religions also emphasize the limits of human knowledge when dealing with tragic events. Rowe thinks an indirect approach to challenging the first premise is better. Rather than directly showing that premise 1 is false, this approach begins with a different starting point. The indirect theist defense builds a parallel argument to the atheist version. On the left, you see the atheist three-step argument from the problem of evil. Notice the different first premise of the theist's counter-argument. The theist's first premise asserts that there exists an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving being. Both arguments share premise 2. Due to the different first premises, the atheist and theist reach opposing conclusions. In the final part of the essay, Rowe discusses the various ways a believer in God could try to justify belief in the theist's first premise. At this point, however, Rowe simply wants to show that the theist's counterargument is just as valid of an inference as the atheist's original three-step argument. When judging the validity of an argument, it is important not to be distracted by specific claims made by the argument. You can formalize the atheist arguments in a few different ways. It can be understood as a modus ponens inference. Rowe's point is that if the atheist's original argument is valid, then the theist's counter-argument must be valid as well. Formalized this way, you can think of the theist's counter-argument as a modus tollens form of inference. If you start with the claim that there exists an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God, the negation of the atheist's conclusion, then you will logically conclude that there are no cases of preventable unnecessary suffering. But what could justify the theist's first premise, namely that there exists an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God? Rowe examines this issue in the final part of his essay in an attempt to better understand the different viewpoints of some atheists and theists. Is it ever rational for a person to believe in the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God? Rowe considers this question from his own atheist outlook. Given his own rational grounds for rejecting a belief in such a God, could he ever grant that it might be rational for another individual to believe in theism? Rowe recognizes three general positions an atheist can take on the rationality of theist belief. There is unfriendly atheism, indifferent atheism, and friendly atheism. The unfriendly atheist judges the believer in the supremely good God as irrational. The indifferent atheist holds no belief as to whether an individual could rationally justify belief in God. Finally, there's the friendly atheist who believes that for some individuals, belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God could be rationally justified. Rowe himself is a friendly atheist. To understand Rowe's position, it helps to remember the difference between rational grounds for belief and definitive proof. Having irrational grounds for a belief does not guarantee it's true. To more clearly illustrate the difference between rational grounds and proof, Rowe considers the example of a plane crash. In the example, you survived the plane crash but have not yet been discovered by rescuers. Your friends who have found out about the plane crash have rational grounds for believing that you are no longer alive. But if you're bobbing in the ocean in a life vest, you have rational grounds for believing that you are alive. In this case, it's clear whose rational justification is stronger, but the larger point holds. Two beliefs that oppose each other might nevertheless be both rationally justifiable. But how is it possible to support the first premise of theism's counterargument? This was the premise that held that there exists an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God. Rowe recognizes three possible sources of support. First are the traditional arguments for God's existence. Of the four, the teleological argument is probably the most popular today. It is better known as the argument from design or the intelligent design argument. Another source of support is personal experience. Maybe belief in a God has helped you cope through very difficult times. Or maybe you've been so fortunate over the course of your life that you think it would be disrespectful not to believe that a supremely good divine being has made your life possible. The third source of support is the ability to explain very important events, whether miracles or tragedies. For a believer in an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving divine being, there is the deep-seated conviction that everything happens for a reason, even if that reason is not apparent. Of the three sources of support, the second might be the most helpful for explaining how two individuals who share in common many beliefs about the world might still disagree about whether God exists. To conclude, Rowe takes a closer look at the implications of friendly atheism. The simplest case for the friendly atheist is a person who has not been exposed to atheist arguments. Maybe this person has not been exposed to the various critiques of the traditional arguments for the existence of God, critiques that the friendly atheist finds convincing. But what about the theist who has carefully thought about the many different atheist arguments? What if the theist is just as familiar with these arguments as the friendly atheist, like William Rowe? Even in a more difficult case like this one, where the atheist and theist share all the same reasons for belief, Rowe points out that the two individuals might weigh the specific reasons differently. This difference in which reasons hold more weight could tip the scales in opposite directions. Thus, friendly atheism is possible in all cases. Just because an individual believes in the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God, it does not imply, Rowe concludes, that the individual is irrational. Nevertheless, Rowe himself thinks that the problem of evil justifies atheism.